Beautiful. Thank you so much. Good morning again. Friends, today we continue in our worship series exploring what it means to sink into our sacred stories. While last week we thought about the power of quilting our lives together and into the grand, loving story of God, this week I invite you to think about Saul, known later in the New Testament as the Apostle Paul. I invite you to think with me today about the desire to earn worthiness and accomplish value and secure love. I want to talk with you this morning, in other words, about perfectionism. Let's start with a quick poll. How many of you here would describe yourself as a perfectionist? Okay. And then how many of you would say, no, I'm not a perfectionist, but I do have fairly high standards? Okay. Well, for those of you who are maybe on the fence in denial or don't really know what I'm talking about, consider this. You might be a perfectionist if you feel the need to proofread your text messages. You might be a perfectionist if you couldn't even imagine wearing a shirt that's missing a button on its cuff. You might be a perfectionist if your ears are more attuned to what you've done wrong than what you've done right. You might be a perfectionist if you sometimes exhaust yourself tackling something alone rather than inviting other people to help. You might be a perfectionist if mistakes, even little ones, make you feel ashamed. And you might be a perfectionist if sometimes you find it hard to receive critical feedback and then find it even harder to forgive yourself afterwards. You might be a perfectionist if some part of you believes that you can fail your way out of being loved. You know, we perfectionists very often get pegged as nervous Nellies or overthinkers who just need to find some way to relax. And while there may be truth to that, psychologists who study perfectionism are finding that there is almost always another truth underneath it: trauma. It can be the kind of trauma that is loud or violent, a person who harmed us or an environment that felt perpetually unsafe, or it can be the subtler, quieter trauma of feeling unliked or even just unnoticed by the people who were supposed to take care of us. And in response, we strive to be exceptional. We try to achieve and to present and to perform at the highest levels. We look for something we can point to and say, see, I am worth it. I am worth your love or your friendship or your attention. Look at this thing I can do. Check out this thing that I have. I'm always neat. I'm good at sports. I've made money. I am always on time. I can play or sing or dance or get grades better than a whole lot of other people. See? More and more studies are showing that perfectionism isn't just a personality quirk. It is, in fact, a deep and identity-forming response to trauma. All this makes me think, then, about Paul, who again at this point in the book of Acts is still known as Saul. Saul describes himself as a Pharisee and a son of a Pharisee. He comes then from a lineage of Hebrews who believed in the critical importance of observing the rites, rituals, and beliefs of Judaism. The dietary customs, the Sabbath observances, the monotheistic theology, according to Saul, according to the strictest party of our religion. However, Saul did not grow up in a majority Jewish part of the world. No, instead, he grew up in Tarsus, a city in what is now south-central Turkey. He was, in other words, a minority. He ate different foods and recognized different holidays and worshipped a different God than most of the people around him. The Bible doesn't go into a great deal of detail here, but I find myself wondering, did Saul ever feel left out? Were there moments when Saul felt weird or strange or even unsafe because of his difference? If so, that might help explain a little of who he became. While on the one hand, Saul was defiantly Jewish, a Pharisee no less, who knew the laws and the scriptures and the history of his people with a zealous intensity, Saul was also a superb student of Greek. Biblical scholars still marvel at the sophistication of his writing in Greek, his grammar and his rhetoric, his command of both the Greek language and Greek cultural forms. In other words, Saul was brilliant, a brilliant reader, a brilliant writer, a fierce defender of Jewish texts, and a masterful innovator of Greek culture. Could it be that this weird kid, could it be that as the kid who brought the strange-looking food to the ancient cafetorium, could it be that as a racial and cultural minority, could it be that Saul decided that he needed to earn people's respect by being the smartest kid in class? Could it be that he sank into his people's sacred story, fiercely defending traditional Judaism, deciding that if he was going to be an outsider, then he would be a fierce outsider, while at the same time, he learned Greek better than probably most of the Greek kids around him? Did he go home and show his parents his top grades? Did they smile and reward him with hugs? Could that be why he learned how to read Hebrew and read Greek and then learn how to write at a level that still makes scholars swoon with admiration? Maybe Saul was a perfectionist. Maybe, like so many perfectionists, he didn't just hold himself to a high standard, but he held the people around him to a high standard too. Maybe that's why he pursued the followers of Jesus so relentlessly, not just because he objected to what he thought was their heresy, but because he could not stand their weird customs. Could not stand the way they made room for people considered unclean. Maybe he could not stand the idea that an uneducated carpenter's son would be unraveling the edges of the practices he believed were critical. Christians, you see, especially in those early days of this faith, were largely working-class peasants, uneducated, unfit, probably mostly illiterate. Maybe that's why Saul so desperately wanted to root out Jesus' followers, because they were so grossly falling short of his incredibly high standards. So what changed? How did Saul go from being what he was to becoming what we know him as today? Well, according to the book of Acts, it happened this way. You can follow along in your bulletins if you like. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way of Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And then Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but they saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. In and of itself, it's powerful and poetic that a person was on a journey, had a divine encounter, and then is struck blind until at some point he gains new vision. That's a profound story, no matter who's involved. However, knowing what we know about Saul, this is all the more poignant. When that flash of light from heaven came down, yes, Saul lost his ability to see. What was even more devastating, no doubt to him though, given what we know about Saul, is that this flash of light caused him to lose his ability to read. Saul lost his ability to write. Saul lost in that moment, and as far as he knew, forever, the very foundations upon which he had built his whole identity. Saul lost the very things that had made him exceptional. Suddenly, everything about his story that had made him think he was worthy, everything about his story that he had depended upon to earn love, all of his skill and brilliance in writing and reading, all of that was gone. And only Saul was left. Just Saul, blind, helpless, and effectively illiterate. The Bible is chock full of people who lose what matters to them most. These are stories of a kind of perfectionism that gets hollowed out, stories of people losing that which they thought had made them special, worthy, or loved. Think about Job, a righteous man who had everything a person in the ancient world could want. He is famous for his wealth and status, in fact. And then, based on nothing but a cosmic wager, it all goes away. Think about Peter, the one who prided himself on his loyalty to Jesus, but then later on denounces Jesus 3 times in public. Think about the priest Zechariah, celebrated for what he could do with his voice, but then is eventually rendered mute. Think about the rich man who comes to Jesus, ready to slide his way on into heaven, but then goes away weeping when Jesus tells him to give away all of his wealth. Think about Samson, whose strength came from his hair, and then he finds it all cut off one terrible day. Story after story in the Bible asks us the same question. What do you do when the thing you think matters most about you, the thing you think is the reason you are loved or respected or admired or accepted? What do you do when that thing is gone? And you're just left with plain, old, imperfect you. And time again, the Bible gives us the same answer. Time and time again, these stories tell us that when we lose what we think is the reason, the basis, the justification for our being loved, that's exactly where faith comes in. Rather than continue to root down in an effort to earn acceptance or to be perfect, the tradition we follow has stories that call us into faith. But, you might be thinking to yourself, I can appreciate all that you're saying about perfectionism, Tony. I can appreciate all those stories of loss and learning and all that, but doesn't the Bible actually call us not just to faith, but to perfection? What about, for instance, Matthew chapter 5, verse 48? I know all of you are thinking right now. Jesus says, be perfect. Jesus says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly God is perfect. Unfortunately, yes, many Bibles do say that. I don't say unfortunately, though, because I want the Bible to say something different. I say unfortunately because I wished that translation were different. You see, the Greek word there translated as perfect is telos, a word that doesn't mean perfect in the sense of flawless, but means perfect in the sense of complete. In some places, in fact, telos has a meaning much closer to mature. In other words, Neither the spiritual teachings nor the sacred stories of this religion call upon any of us to be flawless. Again and again, though, they do call upon us to be complete, to be whole, to be mature. And in story after story, we see people like Saul, people who are forced to confront the reality that the thing they thought made them worthy can vanish in a flash. And in that darkness, unsure of where to go or where to turn, God invites us again and again into faith. The kind of faith that is necessary for biblical perfection, that high view of human wholeness, that deep and human sense of maturity. Rather than ask us to be faultless, our sacred stories ask us to let ourselves be loved, just as we are, without all the bells and whistles, without all the decorations, without all the achievements and exhaustion of trying to earn something we already have. I ask you, friends, in what ways in your own life have you been trying to earn your keep? How have you used your achievements or your skills to win love? Let me ask it this way. What might you do if you trusted, deeply trusted, that you were totally, unrelentingly, inescapably loved? Would you be living your life's story differently? How might your gifts come alive with a whole new depth of purpose if you had faith that you were accepted just as you are? If you had no pressure to prove your value, if you had no reason to doubt your worth, what would you do? What battles might you finally stop choosing to fight? What risks might you finally be willing to take? Where might your energy finally stop going? How might you find peace and permission to rest? God is inviting you into human wholeness, into sacred completeness, into spiritual maturity. And in story after story, we see how that way of living into the world requires faith. Whereas perfectionism strives to give proof, faith strives to find footing in things unseen. Whereas the impulse to win approval is based on a desire to control, faith so often is about letting go. Whereas we can fall over exhausted in the need to avoid failure and the demands to keep standards high, faith says that we can close our eyes and rest into a love that is always present, always ready, always waiting for us just to receive it. May it be so. And amen. We now worship God as we present our offerings.